tell Betty Hall this morning that in some ways this sermon is dedicated to Joe Hall. And those of you who've been around a while knew Joe well, and he was a wildlife biologist, for those of you who didn't, and particularly interested in kaibab squirrels, the ones that not only are in the Grand Canyon, where Joe spent most of his time studying them, but also at La Foret, our UCC church camp. And the reason I thought of Joe this week as I was putting the sermon together is because when Bob and I first moved here 9.5 years ago, the halls were one of the people who hosted one of the home meetings so we could get to know the church. And as we were sitting at this home meeting and I was trying to get a sense of who people were, Joe said, "I have a question for you." I said, "Okay." And he said, "Do you suppose you could possibly preach from something besides the Bible?" And my first response was, "Don't think so." And then I thought about that, and I thought, well, I preach a lot of stuff from places other than the Bible, but this morning, 2/3 of the sermon is coming from extra-biblical sources, National Geographic and research on horses. So as I was organized this, is the sermon Joe would approve of, so if you're around, listen up. It is the second Sunday in January, and in most churches where preachers are preaching only from the Bible, they know it's Baptism of Christ Sunday, and so what that means is on this Sunday, everybody gets at least one of the 4 gospel versions of the baptism of Jesus, and we hear about, oh, we're John out. You're fine, okay. Oh, we're John out in the wilderness, and he's doing his thing, and all these people show up, and then we get this story, Jesus comes down, and John says, no, I'm not fit to baptize you, and Jesus says, do it anyway. And so John baptizes Jesus in the Jordan, and then this white dove symbolizing the Holy Spirit comes down, apparently lands on Jesus' head or somewhere, and everybody there hears a voice from heaven, presumably God's voice saying, "This is my son, the beloved," or I love that version from the Message that we heard this morning. "You're my son, chosen and marked by my love, the pride of my life." And how many of your children have not had that feeling about your child? It's a beautiful story. It's a wonderful story, and it was such an important story for Christians that all 4 of the gospel writers put it in their gospels, even though the details vary a little bit. This is sort of the central Christian story. But sometimes some of us wonder, what the heck does the story of Jesus' baptism have to do with me? In fact, what does my own baptism, if I've been baptized, have to do with how I'm supposed to live? And besides loving this story and feeling the warmth of it, what would it mean for me to live out of this story, to make this kind of a foundation for my life? And I begin my suggested answer to those questions in a kind of odd place, which is our horse pasture at home. Now, those of you who are newer to our church family should know that Bob and I have a couple of horses. We have a black, essentially mutt mare named Bella, and we have a gorgeous chestnut Buffalo gelding. His name is Red Hawk. And we live out on about 6 acres just east of Fruta, and most of our property is pasture. There's a house and a little yard and some corrals and then a whole bunch of pasture. And the horse's favorite thing in the world is to go out on pasture, even this time of year, because they get to wander around all day, and even though there's not a lot of grazing grass, they get to graze and be horses. And one of the things we've noticed in this big pasture is they usually spend their time on what's the north side of the pasture. The grass looks the same to us, but they like it way better over there, and that's where they hang out most of the time. About 3 Saturdays ago, Bob and I were out and we were scooping horse poop and cleaning up their corral pens. And we looked out and noticed the horses were doing something totally different. They were over on the south half of the pasture. In fact, they were smack up against the wire fence that runs between our property and the next door neighbors. And as they were standing there against the fence, we noticed that our next door neighbor's horse, his name is Kipper, was lying stretched out on the ground. Now, we were concerned about this because Kipper had been looking pretty haggard. He'd been looking lonely in a horsey kind of way. He'd really not been looking well. And we knew that he wasn't looking well. This is more than you've ever wanted to know about horses, but brace yourself. Horses their very bodies and genes, they are much more likely to be the ones eaten than the ones doing the eating of other animals. And it makes horses kind of spooky, and it's why you never want to walk up behind a horse without letting them know you're there, because they're going to kick the snarch out of you. And it's because why you don't just go up and shove your hand in a horse's face. They find that scary. Horses are adapted as prey animals, and what that means biologically is that horses can only sleep well if there's another horse around. They're adapted to be in community, to be in partnerships, to be in herds, even if it's a very tiny herd. And Kipper had lost his herd. He had had a mare living in the pasture with them, and our neighbor was boarding. In the beginning of November, the mare went somewhere else, and Kipper had not been getting any sleep. Really? And on this particular Saturday, I don't know how the horses communicated this, but somehow they figured this out. And our horses were over there standing guard, and Kipper was stretched out on the ground, totally blissed out, finally sleeping well for the first time in about a month. What I love about this, and why I bring this in as an example, is it is such a powerful illustration of how horses understand community. Kipper needs our horses. At some level, our horses need Kipper. They know that. Totally coincidentally, the same Saturday we noticed this going on with the horses. That evening we were sitting around and Bob was going through some old National Geographic, and he pulled out this story on Japanese macaques, or snow monkeys. Now, any of you who watched the Winter Olympics when it was in Nagano, Japan, and any of you who watched the snowboard half pipe, you know, Sean White, the Flying Tomato snowboarder, some of you at least know what I'm talking about. That was right near this area where these snow monkeys live. And for about the past 40 years, these snow monkeys, they're about this tall. They look like they're wearing parkas. They have this thick brown fur. Their faces look very human-like, except that they're bright red. It's like they've been under a sun lamp too long. And about 40 years ago, these snow monkeys started migrating down from the mountains where they normally live in the winter to the hot springs that are fed by a volcano. And the monkeys go into the hot springs. The monkeys make snowballs. They roll snowballs. The monkeys have snowball fights. This is totally non-adaptive behavior, and biologists cannot figure out why on earth these monkeys would do any of this weird stuff. But their very favorite thing is hanging out in the spa. And honest to Pete, if you've seen pictures of them, it looks just like going down to Uray or Glenwood Hot Springs in the winter, and you've got all these people except the monkeys have more fur on. And again, it's a wonderful example